Okay, hello everybody. So happy Thanksgiving or belated happy Thanksgiving if you already if you're watching this after Thanksgiving, which I assume you are. And I hope the sound quality and the video are appropriate to what we're trying to do here. This is a room I was assigned. I preliminarily was not terribly happy with the setup because I don't think the camera angle is particularly good. And had I to do over again, I would have probably recorded this elsewhere. But nonetheless, we're here, we're trying to make the best of it. So what we're going to do today is, because we're obviously missing a day for week 6, is I want to talk about chapter 12, which really gives us into economic theory. And this is really the beginning part of something I'm going to sort of finish up today. And in some ways, even though this was not my intent, in some ways it makes sense to kind of include both these theoretical discussions in today's class. That is, I'll talk about the Keynesian point of view, named for the British economist John Maynard Keynes, whose work we're going to talk about here in a minute, and then the alternative to that, which is something we call the neoclassical view, or the neoclassical school, which the term neo means obviously that some new version of what was the original sort of economic thinking prior to Keynes coming along in the 1930s and essentially creating macroeconomics, which didn't really exist. In fact, the term macroeconomics did not exist up until sometime after World War II. And I don't know that he coined it, but he certainly made a lot of headway into advancing what was an alternative view of the economy, which takes into account lots of variables which are not always part of the picture. And if you took an econ course in the, say, 1920s, I think I mentioned this before, it would probably be things like demand and supply and things of that nature. And I'm going to try to get this to work. I'm really not familiar with the setup here, and I don't know how this camera equipment was set up, so I apologize for that. I'm kind of doing this on the fly, and but I've spent about the last half hour trying to figure out how they configured it, and it wasn't configured to my liking, but nonetheless, we'll kind of deal with it. So we'll talk about Keynes, where he came along, and how he sort of reversed some of the thinking that had been prominent in economics prior to the Great Depression. Of course, the Great Depression is sort of the singular event, really, which sort of necessitated a rethinking of how economics is supposed to work. And a lot of it had to do with where does government fit in the picture. And the one thing that I think is, it's safe to say, the one very broad area that sort of divides the Keynesians from the neoclassicists, or the classicists in general, is the idea of the role of government. We're going to talk substantially about the role of government here as we get into it. So I'll talk about that, I'll talk about the neoclassicists, and it'll be a good sort of juxtaposition side by side. And then before we leave, I'll talk about money and banking, and that'll bring us current. There's not really much to do in the way of money and banking. I know your text gets into the issue of what banks exist to do, and some of this is very straightforward, and I'm going to let you sort of read this on your own. But what I will do is get into the whole process of money creation, because I think that's really an area that does require some input. And I don't think oftentimes that all topics of economics are able to be read and understood and everything's fine and dandy, because that's not always the case. So we're going to do that. Okay, so that'll be what we do. That brings us current. Next week will be on Thursday. That'll be the very last class session. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all monetary policy and as well as fiscal policy, which are the two elements of policy that involve government. And I don't think any economist, whether they're left, right, or center on the political sphere, on the sort of the continuum, is going to argue that government should not have some sort of role to play in the economy. The question is how much of a role, and how prominent, and how much do we give government leeway to do the kinds of things that support the economy. And there's been lots of disagreement on. There's absolutely no doubt about the fact there's lots of disagreement on this question, and we're going to get into it. That'll be probably the main theme of next Thursday's class. So hopefully we'll be here in class. Hopefully there are no weather-related events or whatever. So we should be good to go. All right. So let's get into. I want to go back just a little bit here in order to go forward, and that's the idea of consumption and savings. So I want to bring up this from last time, where we talked about consumption and savings as being the two things that households can do upon receiving their income. Okay, and it's disposable because in this case all taxes have been paid. So Personal income, you might remember from our previous discussion, was all national income that flows down to households. And that's wages, salaries, rents, commissions, bonuses, tips, interest, dividends, gains, losses, rental income, all these things which can flow to households on a pre-tax basis. And once we take out taxes, then there are really only two things households can do with their money. And that is spend it or save it, spend it or save it. And that's really what's going on. We said the two of these are mathematical complements. That is, whatever percentage of disposable income is made up by consumption, the complement to that must fold into 100%. So if you spend 80% of your income, and whatever it is, it doesn't matter the dollar figure. If you spend 80%, then there must be 20% is saved. And also keep in mind that you can spend more of your income. You can spend 120% of your income. And so this must be a negative 20%. And that's an area where people get a little bit tripped up because they think, how on earth do you have negative savings? It's like negative velocity of a fastball. It doesn't really exist. Well, it does exist. And the reason it does exist is because people are able to tap into other people's savings. And it goes on all the time, all day, every day, where people spend more than what they earn in a particular year because they either tap their existing savings, which is an act of what we call dissavings, or the other element of dissavings is borrowing money, where you're borrowing from someone else's savings. And we make no judgment as to whether or not this is good, bad, whatever. In fact, I would dare say that people probably would not be able to buy a house if they didn't have access to someone else's savings, at least for a time, and they pay them a rent. Usually with an intermediary, bank intermediary, mortgage company, whatever the intermediary is, there's a rent that we call interest, which we all know about, and it's simply the rental cost of money expressed in an annual percentage terms. And we're going to get into that more next week, talking much more about money, and we're going to sort of take it to the sort of the money supply function of the entire economy, and also we'll get to this notion of money demand, which is probably also one that is maybe new to some people. And so as a result, we will get into that, okay? Before I move on to the case, I do want to talk about the fact that we mentioned this idea of tendencies or leanings, and we said the average propensity to consume is that portion of disposable income that in general people will consume, and that we said differs across households based upon disposable income. Those who earn less are going to spend more of their income. I think that's probably an obvious conclusion, and also people who earn more are going to spend less because they're going to save more. And so the corollary to that is the fact that if people with lower income spend more, it must mean they save less, and that's in fact what's going on. So they save a lower percentage of below disposable income, while those with a higher disposable income have a higher percentage of savings. In fact, most of the savings that's been done is in our economies, those who are maybe in the top half, let's say, of households, maybe the top 40%. We oftentimes sort of group households in income based on what we call quintiles, that is 20, 40, 60, 80%. And I would dare say that probably the top 40% of the big savers and the lower 40% of the big borrowers. And there's no criticism of that. A lot of times it's simply a function of age. When we're younger, we tend to borrow more. When we're older, we tend to save more. So it's not even really a question of disposable income so much as it is sort of where people land where they are in life. And that's been well established through economic research. And so the one thing we did talk about, and it's going to tie into where I'm going to go with this, because I want to sort of lead into chapter 12 dealing with Keynesian economics, and it's the idea of the marginal propensities. So it's one thing for us to determine the average, and the average, though, the problem with averages is they are wildly distorted because of differences in values. You have these outlier values that sort of throw things off, and so as a result, sometimes we have to sort of get rid of those outlying values to go with what is more the mainstream. But doing away with all of that, though, and if we simply do not focus on the average, but on what we call the marginal, which is simply the incremental change in something. That's all marginal really is. And for those of you who have taken micro before, you may have heard this term marginal analysis fairly frequently. It comes up a lot. We talk about here in macro in the sense of what if. It's a what if kind of proposition. That is, what if we change disposable income? Now, how would we do that? Maybe we lower taxes. Maybe we increase government spending, all of which boosts disposable income. Or if we go the other direction, we raise taxes, or we cut government spending, and as a result, disposable income goes down. What is the change in consumption going to be regarding relative to the change in disposable income? So it's a math problem. Change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income, and you're going to get some sort of value, and it's going to be a percentage that's going to be complementary to what is not spent but is saved. So together, these are equal 100%. All we're doing here, taking move the decimal 2 points to the left, taking away the decimal sign, the decimal, and just reflects 1.0. So if 75% of the income is spent, 0.75 is the MPC, 0.25 is the MPS, and we arrive at 1.0. Now, why is this important? It's important for one really good reason, and it's got to do with the multiplier. And the multiplier is this. And by the way, there are lots and lots of multipliers everywhere throughout macroeconomics, and we're going to get into really just two of these multipliers in this course, but we will talk a bit about multipliers and what they are all about. And what they're really about is the notion that we make some change to something, whatever it is, taxes or government spending, something which affects disposable income. And we have a pretty good idea of what the effect or the ripple effect of the economy is going to be. And I talked about the fact that economists have advised governments for a long time as to what they think multipliers are at the present. And I think I mentioned in class last week that in the early, or I guess the late 2000s, when the banking industry was sort of weebling and wobbling, the government thought that the MPC was actually higher than it was. And so among the series of stimulus checks that began under the Bush administration, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, people really did not spend that as much. They sort of saved it. And if you save it, then you sort of bring down the multiplier. Because why? Let's just look at the math. Once again, it's the multiplier. It's the reciprocal of the savings rate. It's 1 over the MPS. And so as a result, 1 over MPS, if you have a multiplier, let's say the multiplier is well, let's say the savings rate is 20%, okay? So the multiplier then in this case, I hope you can see this, is 1 over the MPS. And if the MPS is 20%, you're going to get a multiplier of 5. Meaning whatever changes going on in the economy, you're going to have a five-time increase in that. But what if the multiplier went up to, what if it's, if the savings rate went down, meaning the consumption rate went up, 1 over 0.10 is 10. It's a much higher value than the multiplier. And so we need to know what the multiplier effect is. The multiplier effect is simply that which takes into account as people receive more disposable income, what do they do with it? They tend to spend more of it, right? How much of it? Well, it depends upon the MPC, which is the complement of the MPS. In other words, the savings rate, if the savings rate goes up, it must mean the consumption rate goes down and vice versa. So in this case, if the consumption rate goes down from 80% to, I'm sorry, the savings rate goes down from 80% to 10%. I'm sorry, 80%, the savings rate goes up from 80 to 90, I'm sorry. Then the multiplier goes up because it must mean that the consumption rate is higher, meaning if we spend more income, this is not really hard to follow. If we spend more of our income, it's going to have a ripple effect through the economy. That's what a multiplier is. It's a ripple effect. It goes on and on and on. It's the idea that we are simply spending more of disposable income, and savings really is a hindrance to the overall process. Okay, so that's really what's going on there. All right, so I want to sort of link this back here, and this does, I know we're sort of covering some old ground, but I do want to talk about, hopefully you can see this, and I hope I don't have to redo this video, but hopefully you can see this pretty adequately. I'm going to take down the slide package in order to go with the board. Gosh, I hope you can see that. It's there's a lot of glare coming off that, but I want to talk about this idea. I don't know if you can see this very well at all, but hopefully you can. If you can't, we'll talk more on Thursday. But we have a consumption axis and a savings axis, and we have disposable income in both cases here. And so what are we really trying to do? We're trying to say, what does consumption look like? Consumption sort of has this particular configuration. It sort of goes like this, it goes up. And so we have consumption like that. And we have this axis, which is, or this graph, which is a 45-degree line, is bisected by an imaginary, what we call line of equality, which is 45 degrees, which obviously is half of 90 degrees. And it basically says any value, because these are both dollar figures, this is dollar figure, this is dollar figure, any value on that falls along this dotted line is going to be the same value in both axes. And so, so what we got going on here is the idea we got dollars and dollars, then we got savings. I'll come to savings here in a minute. But notice here, we have $0 in disposable income. But what on earth does that mean? And yet we have positive consumption. How could that possibly happen? And we simply refer to that as what we call autonomous consumption. Autonomous consumption is simply the amount that is independent, the spending that is independent of income. Because why? Because of the fact that even if your income goes to zero, it doesn't mean you're going to stop eating or paying your electric bill or whatever. You're going to do things like tap savings. You're going to borrow money. You're going to borrow money from whomever, or you're going to get transfer payments from the government. And maybe all of the above, right? Maybe all of the above. So as a result, you're going to have some amount of spending that's going to be independent of the income function itself. But notice it sort of slopes upward, and the sloping upward, remember this is a straight line, so we have a change in consumption, that's the vertical axis, change in disposable income, that's the change in the horizontal axis. Well, that's the same as the MPC, right? The MPC is defined as the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income, okay? And at this point here, there is no there's zero savings, because consumption exactly equals disposable income. So there must be zero savings. And so if it's zero savings, we'll take this all on down here, make a little point there. And if there's any amount here in which consumption is greater than disposable income, well, then we simply say this is a condition of what we call dis savings. In other words, we spend more than what we earn. So as a result, we have a dis savings condition. It looks like this. I hope you all can see this. This is not the easiest format to deal with, but and then we have the savings function looks like this. If there's negative savings, which is what dis savings is, we have a savings function that falls below the axis here. So we simply call that the savings function. And we have savings here that is also negative. And so the dis savings here equals the dis savings here. They're just being reflected in two different graphs. And where consumption is greater than disposable income, we simply say that represents savings. Okay, I'm sorry, consumption is less than disposable income. Consumption is less than disposable income. So, and that represents savings. And so as a result, we have a positive savings amount, and we'll simply fill in this little wedge here. And it's going to be the same as this amount here, which is also positive savings. So, and again, the slope of both these functions, we're going to say they're linear. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But in reality, we're going to say this change in savings divided by the change in disposable income is the MPS. And that allows us to know what the multiplier is, okay? We need to know this. Why do we need to know it? We need to know it because it's going to be important for us to devise policy that makes sense. And if policy doesn't make sense, then we're not going to get to where we're trying to be, okay? So anyway, that's a little bit hard to see, and gosh, I wish I had a different room. If anybody is not seeing that, maybe nobody's really seeing that, then we'll have to figure something out here, because I should have done the original room that I recorded the last one in, but this is the room that was assigned. So anyway, enough of my problems. Okay. All right. So that is a refresher then, really, as to the issue of what the multiplier is about, why it's important, and why we want to deal with it. Okay. Let's launch ourselves into schools of macro thought here. And this is really, I think, this is really the main event of what we're trying to get to tonight. And let's talk first of all about one set of theories. And by the way, economists, I think most economists today would sort of accept the fact that both schools have something to be said for them, and there's a lot in the favor of both of those. It's possible, and we'll talk about this next week in class, hopefully. It's possible to sort of reconcile these seemingly incompatible views of these two theories, which on their face look very opposite one another. And I want to try to sort of bridge that gap a bit. So one thing I mentioned, I think I mentioned in class last week, was the idea, maybe I didn't, but we have two schools of thought, and the slides for this week are going to go up whenever I post the video links, probably tomorrow, but Thanksgiving. today's Wednesday, I'll post this at some point. We have the Keynesian school, and we'll talk about what that's about. And the Keynesians, or the quote unquote, the neo-Keynesians are, have taken to refer to themselves as the mainstream school. They believe that what they are advocating is very conventional economics, involving government where government is needed in order to bridge the gap in demand, and demand is a big factor there. And then we'll talk about the classical or neoclassical school. The reason we have these kind of broken down, I don't know if your text really got into this, but the classicists were sort of the original economic thinkers going back to the 18th century. Excuse me, we had Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, just a lot of different names of people who had ideas about how the economy worked, and economics sort of grew out of political science. It was sort of an outgrowth, more of a philosophical outgrowth as to how economy should operate. And Adam Smith is one of those thinkers who's, I think a lot of people put him in the category of the first economist, although his work was not particularly mathematical in those days. But he did advocate for the fact that people should be allowed to do whatever it is they want to do. They want to start a business, feel free to start a business. Buy a house, without government intervention. And in fact, he made the case that government intervention was not helpful. In fact, not only was it not helpful, it was actually harmful to economic growth. And so he fit into this original view we call the classical school. The neoclassicists were probably as much a reaction to the Keynesians as anything else, but they sort of latched on to some of these basic ideas of economic freedom, free enterprise, limited government, all that, which sort of flows out of the classical school. And we're going to talk about a couple different branches of the neoclassical school before we are done today. Yeah. So let's talk about the Keynesians. So first of all, who is Keynes, and where did he come from, and what's he up to? So Keynes is an interesting character in a lot of ways. He started to make his mark in economics right after World War I, where he was a member of the British Treasury Department at the Versailles Peace Conference, which basically laid out the terms of what the world was going to look like after World War I was concluded. And he was there as an economic advisor. They disagreed vehemently with the British government's position that the German government should, and the German economy should be basically taxed into oblivion, just huge reparations. The idea being, hey, Germany, you started this awful war and you've lost it, and now you're gonna pay. And Keynes would say, okay, the war's over. Requiring them to pay is going to be very detrimental to everyone's economy, including theirs. What they're probably going to do is print more money in order to pay the debts to foreign governments. By printing more money, it's going to create inflation. We've talked about this idea: if the government FedExes you $1 million, what happens? It's great from day one. Everything after day one or soon after is not going to be good. But that's what the German government actually did do. They inflated their currency, and we had wild inflation in the 1920s. And what Keynes said was, at the time, considered completely unhinged and bonkers. He said, what's going to happen is you're going to radicalize the German people, and we're going to have another world war, because this is only halftime. World War I is over. That's the first half. We're going to have a second world war. And this was unbelievable to a lot of people at the time. He was sent home from the Versailles Conference, and yet he was completely right. But practically every subject, the German government did inflate their currency. They had wild inflation during the 1920s. They had a series of governments which were unstable, obviously leading to what we all know as being the Nazi government beginning in 1933 and World War II, which followed. So he was right, checking boxes, check, all the way across. And so one of the things about Keynes, which I think is interesting, is the idea that, he had sort of a unique quality to put things together. One thing leads to another, leads to another, and this is what's going to happen once you sort of connect the dots. And today, that's probably not a unique skill, because I think a lot of us do that, I think. But in his time, people did not tend to look out to the future to say, this thing will lead to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And yet, that is really what Keynesian policy is based around, is the idea that we're trying to understand where things are going and why, okay? And one thing, in other words, one thing that will lead to another. So when we talk about Keynesians, Keynes and those who followed him, he died in 1946, so he wasn't really terribly old, but he had some heart troubles and whatnot. So he died in 1946. His major work was published in 1936. Later editions were made mostly in Britain and America Paul Samuelson, who's one of the top economists in America, John Hicks, a British economist who sort of took a lot of Keynesian theory and made it operational in terms of the mathematics and the graphics and all that, some of which I'll get into it here in a minute, James Tobin, etc., including those that we call neo-Keynesians today. And sometimes in this country, they're doing saltwater economists. And as they tend to be sort of clustered around universities on either coast, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Columbia, those are East Coast schools, Stanford in the West. And it's just a term of art, whether you like it or not. It's kind of when we talk about saltwater economists, we're talking about those that tend to have an affiliation or an affinity to Keynesian theory. Okay, so what about Keynes and what is he up to? And let me, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what his major contribution was to economic thinking, particularly during the Great Depression. And I'm going to sort of lay this out a bit for you here. I'm going to sort of bring the screen up, and I don't know if it's helpful if I turn the lights down or what, but there's a reason why I went into this methodology here with regard to consumption and savings. And it's because of the fact that I want to sort of make an expansion of that to bring in the entire macroeconomy. And that is this. I want to say here that the economy itself is, if we simply say all aggregate expenditures is what constitutes demand, instead of the disposable income, we're going to say all income in the economy. And so we're going to simply refer to that as GDP, okay? And on the vertical axis, we're simply going to start with a very limiting example here of demand. And we're going to start with consumption and investment only consumption and investment. Okay, we'll bring in the exports and all that a bit later. Right now, this is sort of the limiting condition that we're going to sort of set for ourselves. And we're going to say, we're going to go back to this idea. We have the same 45-degree line that we had with the more limited view over here. So we have 45 degrees that really reflects what's going on in the macroeconomy. And that is everything along that 45-degree line is the line of equivalence, the line of equality, whatever you want to call it. And if we just take consumption and investment, just that, aggregate expenditures here is only equal to consumption plus investment. We get this. The amount of spending in the economy translates to the amount of GDP, and we'll simply refer to that as Y0. Okay, that's sort of the starting point. That is where the current condition is with regard to the economy. Here's the problem, okay, and all we've done here is involve consumption and investment, and we can bring government spending into. Remember, the expenditures approach said that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment. That's household spending, business spending, government spending, and the difference between net exports, which is exports minus imports. And so we're saying that, okay, we've got this going on. What if we include government now, and we add government to the picture? So we have consumption plus investment plus government spending. And so as a result, we add another layer here of spending, and that's aggregate expenditures equals C plus I plus G. We haven't brought in the global economy yet, and we'll call that Y1, okay? Here's the problem. This is all well and good. It simply says that really what Keynes is advocating is, we're trying to promote is the idea that government spending, or I'm sorry, spending in general, whether it's household spending, business spending, government spending, whatever, creates demand in the economy, okay? And demand in the economy pushes GDP to the right. Here's the problem though. What if, these are all GDP figures, but what if full employment GDP is right here, right? So you've got a gap. You've got an output gap, which is recessionary. And we had a huge gap during the Great Depression. And so what Keynes was advocating is some additional change to something that results in additional government spending. And so as a result, you need consumption plus investment plus government spending, and it's a bigger value in order to bring ourselves up to it. And yet, whatever this gap is, let's go with small numbers here. Let's say it's $1 trillion and the multiplier is 5, let's say. I don't know what the multiplier is. Then we only need 200 million or 200 billion, I should say, in spending in order to make that. Why? Because the change in demand here, what we call aggregate demand, and I'll get to that more in a minute, times 5, which is the multiplier, and we're just sort of given this. The change in aggregate demand is 200 billion times 5 will lead us then to a change in GDP which is going to be $1 trillion. 200 billion times 5 is 1 trillion. So we don't need a 1 trillion of new spending. We just need a little bit of what we call priming the pump. Now, the term priming the pump, which I sort of, it's Keynes' own terminology, and I think I included it in the discussion activity. It's kind of an old-fashioned term. We used to have to prime engines, used to have to inject a little fuel. We still have to do, I think, in lawnmowers today. But it really is the idea that you have to sort of give a little bit of boost to things, and then the system will take care of itself. And what Keynes is saying is that all you really need to do is increase government spending a little bit in order to put people to work. And it doesn't really matter what they're doing. And this is where Keynes gets really controversial, particularly among those who think that government sometimes does a lot of things that are wasteful and not particularly helpful. But he was saying, look, even if you did this, even if you put 200 people to work in the first shift digging the hole, and then 200 people work in the second shift filling the hole back up, you would still be better off economically than where you were beforehand, even though no real activity's been done, nothing's been created, but you created demand for 400 new workers, and so that those wages of those 400 government government work, and I get the criticism. Oh, this is pretty good. I think we can finally see this a little bit better now. At least when I can see it. Oh, now the light came on, so maybe not. But so what Keynes is basically saying is it doesn't really matter what the demand is for. $1 of demand on anything is better than no demand if you are operating below full employment. And that's what's really going on here is one of the key ideas of Keynesianism is the idea that government can bridge those gaps where households and businesses can't do it. And during the Great Depression, the government made lots and lots of mistakes early on, and if they didn't know they were making mistakes. And some of it had to do with monetary policy, which we haven't really talked about yet. We will next week. And Keynes was a critic of that. He should have been a critic because monetary policy was abysmally done, just horrible monetary policy by the U.S. government and by all governments around the world. A lot of it had to do with the fact that everyone wanted to tie the value of the currency to gold, which is a completely ridiculous standard. And today, there are almost no currencies in the world that do link themselves to gold, certainly not the US dollar. And we haven't for a very long time. So the idea is to manage the economy and doing it. But he was really, I think, a big advocate of fiscal policy as to achieve his objectives. And obviously, we can bring the next picture into it. That's not really the main thing. And I know that if you're really interested in this theory, we can certainly talk outside of class about this, if you are. But there's a lot going on here. Most of it having to do with what government ought to be doing in order to deal with an economy that's out of control. And by out of control, we are simply mostly referring to the idea that government can fill unemployment gaps. And the government's got a role to play in that regard. So some of the tenets of Keynesian theory are these. Again, I'll post these PowerPoints so you can have them. Is that number one, economies in Keynes's view are inherently unstable. And this kind of, you might think, well, okay, yeah, that's probably right. We probably know that. But I think the early theorists, the early classical theorists would say that economies are mostly stable. And all the economy is, all the macroeconomy is, in the classical view, is simply a collection of all individual markets. Goods markets, labor markets, financial markets, they're all the same thing. And yes, there are periods of instability, but when things get out of whack, they will get themselves back into the correct position on their own. Keynes was saying, no, it doesn't work that way. They can get stuck, and they get stuck in what he called underemployment equilibrium. And that is the idea that he pushed back on this idea that markets will self-correct. This was a really important criticism that Keynes had, and his later followers, the Keynesians who came after him, said, look, the markets don't just adjust. They can get stuck in underemployment equilibrium for a long time. It's kind of like this. And by the way, you can be in equilibrium. Remember, and we talked a little bit about this in class with regard to aggregate demand and supply being equilibrium. And we said, what is equilibrium? It's a condition of balance, short-term stability in a economic system, whether it's a market, industry, or entire economy, and it's relatively stable. But the problem is, you can be stable, but you can also be operating in a very underperforming kind of way. Think about this. Let's say you have a stick shift and you want to take a trip to wherever, Las Vegas, right? You want to go on vacation. You have a stick, you want to drive in first gear all the way. You'll get there and you'll get a constant speed of 10 miles an hour all the way down the freeway. It'll take you a couple days to get there. You're in equilibrium. Nothing's changing. Everything is constant. The velocity hasn't changed. But you're getting there. You're making progress, but not really, because you're going 10 miles an hour. But you're in equilibrium. Everything's stable. But being stable is not the goal. Being optimal is what the goal is. It's more optimal to go 65 or 70 or whatever in order to get there. And by the way, what if you do drive a car at 10 miles an hour? I'm sort of mixing metaphors, and I realize that. Are you doing damage to the vehicle? In other words, what's the metaphor with the economy? If you're operating well below full employment year after year after year, you're doing damage. You are. You're doing damage to your economy. Because you have people not working, people losing skills, businesses can't acquire talent that they need. Nobody wants to invest in new projects because if you can't sell anything, why make something if you can't sell it? You can't sell it because nobody's got purchasing power. And so as a result, yes, we're in equilibrium and we're stable, but we're operating at a suboptimal level. So Keynes is saying, look, the system is not stable and it sometimes needs intervention. And by the way, this is not all that radical of an idea if you consider the fact that the government is ours, really, and that we expect government to do things. And most of us do. And during the pandemic, we expected the government to do things like, give us information as to what to do about the virus and vaccinations and all that. And I know this is not at all what was on Keynes's mind in the 1930s, but you kind of get the idea that government's got a role to play. Some of the other tenets are that aggregate demand, aggregate supply are unpredictable and unstable. And by the way, I'll get to the neoclassical view here in a second. I'll probably cut this video off just to post separate video links so that you don't have to sit on a computer for 3 hours to watch one video. But you'll see that a lot of these are diametrically opposite when we talk about the neoclassicists who think that things are pretty much okay. And government is maybe not the solution, maybe the problem. We'll get to them, okay? Consumption investment can always be counted on to boost aggregate demand. And it kind of goes to the idea that we just can't count on private actors to solve what is a big societal problem. And Keynes had all kinds of solutions, and some of them are, and by the way, his major work is called The General Theory. It was published in 1936. Most economists have read it. I've read it 2 or 3 times. It is the worst thing I think I've ever read. Paul Samuelson even is one of our major economists said it was just the most difficult read ever. He will talk about inventory M for whatever reason. He'll say wages are a Y or whatever. I mean, and you got to sort of follow the dots. And Keynes himself said, look, I wrote this quickly. It was an emergency. And I wrote it for professional economists. Page 1 of that book says this book is for professional economists. And it's a hard read, but it's an important read because it basically lays out his case of what economies look like. They're unstable. And I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that we have periodic ups and downs and manias and boosts in unemployment, and we can't always explain it. And I think one way to look at it is the fact that the economy is unstable generally, because life is unstable and we don't know what's coming. If we all knew it was coming, life wouldn't be very interesting. It'd be safer, but it wouldn't be very interesting. So it's kind of the way it is. Okay. So it also advocates increases in aggregate demand. This is very much a demand side theory, almost exclusively focusing on the demand side. This is what opens Keynes and his later adherents to criticism, is the idea that it's a mostly demand side theory, and that government can increase government spending in order to do things like hire 200 guys to dig a hole, hire 200 to fill it back up. And it can be done without inflation. I'll show you a graph of what Keynes envisioned aggregate supply look like. I'll do that next week, okay, in class. And then monetary policy, which we haven't really talked about much. And I know that this particular textbook has the chapters kind of ordered in a weird way. I've kind of done my best to adapt the course to sort of accommodate that, but I did make a point early I think around week 3 or so, to talk about the differences in the two classes of economic policy, government economic policy, fiscal policy, which is budget policy, taxation and government spending, and monetary policy. And we're going to talk about both of those in week 7. We're going to tie all this together in one nice package in week 7. But what Keynes is saying about monetary policy, it's not very effective. That you can lower the interest rate all the way down to 0, and it doesn't make people necessarily want to borrow. And what's really interesting about this idea is that it was, I think, theoretical. It was mostly untested until around 2008, 2009, and the years following that great, what we call the Great Recession, a bunch of bank failures that led to a downturn, and the interest rates were extremely low for borrowers. And yet, borrowers did not exactly come out of their houses to want to borrow money. So you can't make people borrow money, and that's a lot of what the monetary policy mechanism is about. It's about the price of money. Even if you lower it to very low levels, it doesn't make people want to borrow because they only want to borrow if it makes their particular needs. You know, 2008, 2009, when the economy was really teetering, tottering on what could have been a depression, not just a recession, but a full-blown depression, it really didn't make any difference. And so Keynes was sort of justified, and the Keynesians really got a wind at their backs in that particular time period. And one final thing, discretionary fiscal policy is the preferred tool. So again, fiscal policy and monetary policy, the two categories of government involvement in the economy. Fiscal policy is basically the idea of government spending and taxes. Those are the two categories that we talk about. And Keynes is an advocate for the idea that we, during an economic downturn, maybe we cut taxes or we increase spending. And by the way, even if we have to spend money that we don't have because taxes aren't sufficient, we can run a deficit. And all we're really doing is this. And I hope you guys can see this, but all we're doing by spending more is simply pushing GDP to this direction, even if we have to go into debt to do it. And by the way, this is not all that radical of an idea today, because our government has got lots and lots and lots and lots of debt. Our government is the biggest debtor in the world by far, by far, by far, by far. Mostly because of the fact that we simply raise money to pay for spending that is not met by taxes. And this gives us a whole lot of other directions to go, and I know a lot of students want to talk more about that, but in an introductory class, I think we're going to sort of cut that off here. So I'm going to stop this particular video here, and I want to get to do a little setup and talk about the classical school or the neoclassicists and what they're all about, and just a bit on the money banking function. It's a really brief chapter, and it's intended to be, and one reason why is because it's just a sort of introduction to this econ majors, which I know most of you are probably not going to be a bachelor's degree student in econ. There's a class, a dedicated class, usually 300 level, which deals nothing but money banking, and so it's covered in much more detail there. But we will open the door a little bit to covering that. Okay, so all right, I'll stop this here, and if anybody has any questions about anything, you know where to reach me, and I will pick it up here in a second with the discussion of the classical school.